Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. Good morning, everybody. In this video, I address the first round of the study questions about Ernest Hemingway's short story Indian Camp. A few words about Hemingway himself. Hemingway is a prolific novelist, short story writer, and journalist. Prolific means he wrote a lot. He wrote many short stories, 6 novels, 3 well-known of which are The Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man, and The Sea, which has been translated into many languages. And I am sure at a certain point in your life, you read this story, encountered it, or at least heard of it. Al-Ajuzu wal-Bahr, The Old Man and the Sea. He was well known for his terse, concise, and simple style. He wrote in non-complex syntax but still lucid sentences. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954, and he ended his life in 1961. That's briefly about Hemingway. Now let's get started with the questions that are in front of me here on my laptop. The first question: where did Nick and his father go, when, how, and what for? So Nick accompanied his father and Uncle George, father who is a doctor, and Uncle George to the Indian camp, which is located on the other side of the lake, where because they are summoned to help women who had been already trying to deliver a baby, and she's racked by the pain of labor. So they are there to basically to help her. What was the situation when they got there? So the situation in the shanty was miserable, and some of you or many of you mentioned that, but many students didn't mention or didn't provide evidence from the texts. So whenever we say something, we have to support it with evidence from the text. Because the situation was miserable and abject. Why? Because the woman was screaming, suffering from the pain of labor, because the husband was on the upper bank, cut his leg. Is it leg or arm? I don't remember. With an axe. And he was severely wounded. He was also smoking a pipe, and the room is filled with the smoke, and the room smelled badly. So this is symbolic and indicative of the abject conditions in which Indian Americans live, particularly in contrast with white Americans who live in favorable conditions. The third question: how do you know that Nick's father is performing his duties in unfavorable conditions? Well, the doctor performed an impromptu cesarean on the woman. Impromptu means something which we do unprepared. Impromptu. I did something impromptu. It's an improvised operation which he performed on the women without the basic conditions which are required in typical medical surgeries. He without anesthetization, and with just a fishing knife. Which is, of course, indicative of the skill of the doctor. How do you know that Nick... No, the fourth question. How does Nick react to the women's screams? How does his father react? So, Nick, upon hearing the women screaming, Nick asked his father to give her something to calm her down, to reduce her pain. And he's showing here feelings of empathy, of sympathy, and of compassion. And I want to open two brackets here. Whenever, please try not to copy chunks from the story or sentences from the text to answer the questions. Try to rephrase, to rewrite what you read in the text and put it in your own words. Try to look for adjectives which summarize these chunks or whole sentences. So it's your task to paraphrase, to write things in your own words and not merely to copy paste from the text. Well, where we stop, number 4. Yeah, how does his father react? His father, on the other hand, seems to be disinterested, disassociated, and disengaged from the women's suffering. I'm sorry, from the women's suffering, and that shows maybe lack of understanding on his part, but also an act of humiliation and denigration of the women. Let's go back to the text itself. No, I haven't any anesthetic, his father said, but her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important. So maybe he's callous or he's lacking understanding and compassion. The questions again. How does Nick feel while his father was operating on women? How does the father feel, and how do you feel about it? While Nick may be frustrated because of his father's negative attitude towards the women, during the operation, and while his father was urging him to observe him operate on the women, he reclined, he turned his head, he seems to be, or he becomes disassociated and disengaged, and I would not say indifferent. The text, he was looking away so as not to see what his father was doing. Nick did not watch. His curiosity has been gone for a long time. While his father, on the other hand, after the operation, he becomes jubilant, joyful, and exalted, extremely happy and proud because of his achievement, the achievement of operating impromptu with very basic elementary tools. He was feeling exalted and talkative as football players are in the dressing room after the game. Now, how do you feel about the father? Some of you, and most of you indeed, interpreted the father's reaction during and after the operation as, especially during the operation, as indifference and even humiliation, and after the operation as arrogance. But there is also another interpretation, valid interpretation, which is that of a typical doctor. Consider a typical doctor, and he needs to be shut off from all these distractions, from the screen, because doctors are used to screaming and pain and moaning, whining. They need to be shut off from these distractions, from the screaming and all what's going on, in order to do their job, do their duty. So because we are not used to that, we are not familiar to that, we show some degree of compassion towards the suffering of people, of patients. Doctors need to concentrate on their work. So I would interpret the father or the doctor's attitude as merely as cold professionalism. He's professional, he's doing his job as coldly and as professionally as possible. But the matter is open to interpretation, of course, and you would interpret it as you wish, provided that you support your the idea with evidence from the text. Let's go back to the questions again. Uncle George. Okay, we'll skip this question and go to 7 and go back to Uncle George. Why do you think that the Indian husband committed suicide? Give reasons and explain how Hemingway prepares the reader for the husband's suicide. Well, there are three interpretations for the husband's suicide. The first is that he committed suicide because he was racked with pain. He could not bear the pain. The pain was so unbearable, and he was so attached to his wife that he couldn't stand it, and he committed suicide. Second interpretation is that he committed suicide because of out of the feelings of humiliation, denigration, and helplessness. After he heard the words, the negative and the negative words of the doctor, and after he perceived the doctor's denigrating attitude towards his wife. Notice how he, let's go back to the scene once again. No, I haven't any anesthetic, his father said, but her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important. Now, immediately after this scene, okay, the sentence comes, the husband in the upper bank rolled over against the wall. So it is at this moment, upon hearing the words of the father, of the doctor, that the husband rolled over on his bank against the wall. And probably it is at this moment that he committed suicide, or started to commit suicide. So, second interpretation, that he ended his life out of the feelings of humiliation and helplessness. The third interpretation is that maybe he suspects that the baby is not his own, for the reasons which I'm going to address soon. Now let's go back to in this interpretation, he committed suicide out of the feelings of shame and of his shame of his cuckoldry, of the feelings of the shame of violation, because of the violation of his right as a father, a violation of his dignity, of his as I said, of his dignity as a legitimate, supposedly legitimate father. Now let's go back to the question about Uncle George. Uncle George, the character of Uncle George in the story is quite intriguing for these reasons. Okay, now take note of some incidents which are related to this character. The first is that Uncle George, unlike the other characters, white characters, especially the Doctor and Nick, cherishes a kind of intimate, warm relationship, friendly relationship with the Indians. Notice how he handed them cigars after the birth of the child. Maybe he's celebrating the birth of the child. Maybe his father. Maybe, I don't know. So, especially that I read somewhere that that American Indians used to hand cigars to people nearby after the delivery of after the birth of the child. The other incident which is related to that's my baby crying. After another incident which is related to Uncle George is notice how he didn't go back with Nick and the Doctor at the end. He stayed in the Indian camp, and he stayed there for a reason, apparently. The third incident about Uncle George is that notice how the women bit him instead of biting the other two women were holding her while the Doctor was operating on her. Why? Maybe she's taking revenge on him. Maybe she's so intimate with him. Maybe she accuses him of being the reason for the cause of her suffering. So anyway, so that's for us to consider as well. The fourth thing which I'd like to draw your attention is the fact that the guy who's on the upper bank on the Indian women has never been called as a father, but only as the Indian man and as husband in the story. He's called as the husband, but never as the father. Why? Okay, Hemingway is so smart, maybe to not to explicitly state or state the fatherhood, the fact that the Uncle George is the father, but he wants us to understand that from those small incidents. Well, why does Nick feel he will never die? Actually, will never be sure why he feels that he will never die. A statement which occurs at the very end of the story. But there are two interpretations. The first is that this is an illusory, childish illusion, which children usually embrace or espouse. It's a childish illusion, it's a wishful desire, which children used to or are used to hold and think about. Remember, when we were children, we used to think, to espouse and to embrace ideas which are crazy, which are not realistic, and which appear to us when we were grown as illusions, as mere impossibilities. So he wants to kind of cherish this idea of immortality. But the second interpretation, into which I am much more inclined, is that he upon seeing the horrible scene of the suicide, he decided that he will never die, in the sense that he will never commit suicide. And why I am holding on to this interpretation is because Hemingway himself, at the back of the mind of Hemingway and in his consciousness, the idea of death is present. The idea of death indeed infiltrates all of his works, short stories and novels, and it's always there. He's always thinking about death, and the dichotomy and the binary death and life is always present there. Is it contemplating death and the end of life? And ironically, as we saw, Hemingway himself ended his life and committed suicide in 1961. So I'm much more inclined to take this interpretation. How has this experience impacted Nick and his relationship with his father? Go back to the beginning of the story, etc. So we saw the father being jubilant and joyful after the end of the operation, but he was soon frustrated after he realized that the husband committed suicide. Now, Nick, whose curiosity has long been lost, now his curiosity has been provoked, has been sparked again because of the horrible scene. And he addressed a series and a burst of questions to his father about death and the nature of death and life and of suffering. But this time, his father is less confident than he was previously in the story. And let's just notice his answers. Let's go back to the text. Okay, so in reaction to his son's answers, all what he could say is just, I don't know, I guess, hardly ever, it all depends. So all of these answers are unsatisfactory and do not address and do not really answer the burning questions or the questions which are burning inside Nick. So they do not clear the mess in front of his eyes and provide him with satisfactory, clear and unambiguous answers. So what supports this is his relationship accordingly with his father kind of underwent a transformation. Compare the beginning and in the position where he's sitting in the boat in the beginning of the story. Let me go back to the text again. He was sitting next to his father. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. So he's sitting next to his father. He's still under the influence of his father. But at the end of the story, Nick, they were seated in the boat, Nick in the stern, his father rowing. So he sit at the back of the boat, a bit away from his father. So, which indicates that he started to develop a consciousness of his own, ideas of his own, that he kind of started to become independent of his father and tried to pull out of the influence of his father. I will address this idea much more in detail in the next video, but I will leave it at this point, and goodbye.